The lamps burned low in the corridors of the Iron Bastion, a crumbling fortress that had been repurposed as a prison when the old order fell. On that night, the air was thin and sharp, and the silence felt like a held breath inside the ancient stones. In a narrow chamber, high in the tower, Elara Vionne lay beside her 8-year-old son, Julien, her hand resting on his small chest as it rose and fell. She had kept him close since the execution of her husband. The boy was the last fragile anchor of her life. Boots sounded on the stone stairs, measured, purposeful, not the random clamour of patrols. The door burst open under the force of men who carried a decree stamped with the seal of the Council of National Purity. The leader flung the parchment forward as if it were a weapon and read the order in a dry and measured tone. Before she could absorb the words, Elara rose, as if guided by a single reflex, and threw herself between the guards and Julien. Her fingers clung to his arms with the animal fierceness of a mother. She screamed, a raw, unpolished sound that filled the little room. Begs, offers, threats, and promises spilled from her simultaneously. Take me. Do what you must. Spare him. But the guards had been instructed. They had discovered what could not be taken by hunger, ridicule, or cold. The tether of a mother to her child. To sever that tether was to unmoor her completely. For an hour the tower witnessed desperate resistance. Men pushed, shoved, and argued. Elara's voice grew hoarse. Her nails split from clawing at wood and stone. The child, frightened and bewildered, began to cry. When the guards finally used force, tearing Julien from his mother, his cries echoed as they descended the spiral stairs and into the night. Elara collapsed against the wall, clutching air where her son had been, and that moment marked the first cleaving and incision that would be widened over the days to come. She spent hours on the cold floor afterward, clinging to the memory of his small hand, while the bastion resumed its ordinary watchful hum. The men who took Julien did not look back. They moved through shadowed passages with the efficiency of those who believe mercy is weakness. Outside the tower, the city slept or raged according to the hour, but inside her chest a different sound took up residence, a steady, hollowing dread. The order had been political in language and personal in consequence. It was not merely about re-education. It was about dismantling the last human tether that linked Elara to any future. Elara Vionne had been born Elara Marin of Velestria, the youngest daughter of an influential imperial house, whose alliances and rivalries shaped the maps of her youth. At 14, she was sent to the Ardelian capital as part of a political pact meant to secure peace between rival realms. Her marriage to the future king, Leonard Vionne XVI, was a transaction of statecraft rather than an engagement of hearts. The Ardelian court greeted her with suspicion. Foreign accents and unfamiliar customs made the young bride an easy object of ridicule. Her accent was dissected and mocked. Her choices in dress and leisure became proof, to some, of foreign arrogance, and to others, evidence of frivolity. Loneliness drove her toward private pleasures, to fashion and music and small salons, where she felt less like a token and more like someone with taste and agency. To the starving city beyond palace walls, those displays were monstrous. The caricature of Madame Excess, spread in pamphlets and gossip, an image that required no complex truth and did all the necessary damage. But the woman held in the bastion after the fall of the crown was no longer the figure in caricature. She had buried one child already and had watched public spectacles destroy the man she had been bound to. The label the revolutionaries pinned to her did not fit the private sorrow she carried. She was not a symbolic monster, but a mother who had learned the contours of grief and whose remaining joys were the small faces of her offspring. That was precisely why the new authorities chose to attack what she still loved. In their calculus, stones and hunger might break many kinds of resolve, but love could be turned into a lever. Break the child and you break the mother. Make the son a witness against his own blood, and the spectacle becomes irresistible. The Iron Bastion's damp walls were lined with moss, and the air tasted faintly of rust and old fire. Within its towers, the family's days were measured by footsteps, by the scrape of a bolt, by the soft scrape of a guard's chair. Elara tried to preserve some semblance of life for her children, teaching Celeste arithmetic by candlelight and humming lullabies to Julien. In the smallest rebellions, an extra spoonful of stew, a whispered story, she found fragments of what used to be. But the Watchers recorded everything. Men sat in the shadows with ink-stained ledgers and petty triumphs of surveillance. Conversations were transcribed, smiles were catalogued. The Council of National Purity read reports as if they were architectural plans, looking for the weak joints where pressure would make the structure fail. Restrictions multiplied, first as inconvenience, then as cruelty. Visits to the children's rooms were limited, then denied. Clothing that had been comfortable became a political statement when inspected and judged. Language itself was constrained. The mother tongue of Velestria was forbidden for private utterances, so that the guards could monitor and misinterpret. With each denial, with each rule, Elara felt something inside her tighten and fray. Her hair began to silver at the roots, her body thinned. There were nights when she simply held Celeste and listened to the city and prayed that the child would not be taken too. Even then, she was careful to modulate fear into stoicism, so the children would not see the unravelling. The council realized that spectacle and slow erosion had limits. They required a new instrument, something personal, something dreadful. They found a fanatic named Markel Thorn, a cobbler by trade and a zealot by choice, to shape Julien into an emblem of the Republic. Thorn took the boy into darkness, practicing a method of breaking that combined isolation, falsified instruction, and physical intimidation. Within weeks, whispers of the child changed, of the way he recited new phrases with a hollow cadence, of how his eyes lost the soft gleam that once belonged to a sheltered child. The Bastion's custodians reported back with the tone of satisfied craftsmen. The tool was shaping into what they desired. In the early hours of August, guards seized Elara and carried her through hidden corridors. She begged to say farewell to Celeste, to hold the daughter at least once before whatever came next. But the plea was refused, and the door closed behind her. The carriage that awaited was not the velvet carriage of a sovereign, but a cramped, cold conveyance that smelled of oil and straw. At the Stonehold, they clipped her name from the rolls and replaced it with a number, prisoner 280. Her identity was reduced to a ledger entry. A small wooden tag hung at the cell door, as if she were inventory. The cell itself was a narrow rectangle of damp stone, with a thin straw pallet, a scarred table, and a stool eaten by rot. They placed a folding screen inside to simulate privacy, but it was a theatre prop. 2 armed guards remained within the space virtually every waking hour, watching the small, humiliating gestures of daily life. She was obliged to ask for rags when bleeding worsened. They watched as she bound herself to preserve dignity. Her hair fell away in clumps during those nights, and each time she felt presence and privacy slip a little further. The little rituals that sustain a person, change of clothes, a private cry, a whispered prayer, were slowly catalogued by the men who documented and later used those moments as evidence of the prisoner's moral state. 76 days of this regimen shrank her social self to a raw core of endurance. The state had taken away her name, the queen's robes, the household and the country. Now it sought to take the last elements of her inner life. It was a slow and deliberate unmaking. When the summons came on a cold morning, it was already assumed by everyone who had read the papers that fate had been decided. The tribunal's hall was designed with visibility and spectacle in mind. Persecution looked efficient under its chandeliers. Elara walked in pale and still, refusing to perform theatrical remorse. Julien, the appointed prosecutor, read lists of charges with the rhythm of a litany. Accusations of treason, collusion with foreign princes, and misappropriation of funds formed the framework. Elara answered with clarity and dignity, which provoked irritation more than sympathy among those who had come for entertainment. Then the prosecutor introduced a weapon that required no solid proof, testimony shaped from the punctured mouth of a child. A journalist repeated statements attributed to Julien, phrases cruelly taught to him in a dark room by men who knew how to melt and refashion a young mind. The claim was monstrous. Suggestions that Elara had performed indecencies that no mother could commit. Accusations that were designed to provoke disgust and to silence empathy. At the mention of those words, the room changed tone. Some in the audience flinched. Elara rose to speak not to judges but to the assembled mothers, to the women whose breasts and lullabies had shaped that city, and she implored them to feel whether such a charge could be true. "Is there any among you," she asked, "who, upon hearing such a thing, would not recoil in the name of nature itself?" There was a rustle of movement, a few muffled sobs, but the tribunal, which sought a dramaturgy of condemnation, moved forward. Evidence was secondary. The sentence was preordained. Within 2 days, she received the verdict that had long been composed. Back in the stonehold, they allowed her paper and ink, a slender mercy that made her hands steady. She wrote not to the court, but to Alessa, her sister-in-law, who remained somewhere within the old towers. Her letter filled pages with counsel, consolation, and precise requests. Watch over Celeste, teach her patience, do not let bitterness root in her heart. And to Julien she wrote a plea that he never avenge. She asked for forgiveness for perceived failures, reassured the family that her conscience was clear, and urged that tenderness be returned to the children who had already lost so much. When she sealed the final sheet and signed her name, Elara Vionne, she expected the guard to carry the letter where it belonged. Instead, it was seized, indexed, and stored in the official repository as if it were an exhibit against her. The very thing intended to comfort the living was converted into archival proof of a condemned mind. For decades, the words lay unread by those who needed them most, a secret folded into state files, until a future age could unfold the truth in quieter hands. The withholding of the letter added a further cruelty. The knowledge that even the speech she carefully arranged for those she loved would not be allowed to console them. When the appointed day arrived, she was ordered to prepare. They shaved what little hair she had left, forced her out of the mourning garments she had worn for months, and dressed her in a coarse white shift, the uniform of the condemned. She asked to change privately. That request was denied. Her hands were bound with cords, so tight that the skin at her wrists flared white and red. They led her to a rough tumbrel rather than a closed carriage, and the wheels carried her through streets that had swollen with jeering crowds. People spat and hurled insults, eager for the closing drama. Children whispered and mimicked their parents' imprecations, and artists sketched, hungry for the image of the fallen. She sat on the plank, hands bound, a figure diminished but composed. At the scaffold, she climbed the steps and, by an odd smallness of fate, stepped on the executioner's foot. She turned and said, with that unerring reflex of manners she had practiced as a member of courts, "Forgive me, sir, I did not mean it." The apology hung in the air, in a moment where fury was expected instead. Then the blade fell. In their zeal to erase the symbol, the Republicans had revealed the person, a mother whose love had been weaponized against her, a woman who had lost everything and who, in her last breath, offered human grace. That final courtesy was a small, stubborn defiance against the machinery of humiliation. In trying to break her utterly, the state had instead produced an image that would long outlast the particular fury of that day. The machine finished its task, but memory, wounded, complicated, and utterly human, remained. Enduring memory